3 days before the city was supposed to fine an 82-year-old widow nearly $900 over her lawn, her next-door neighbor stood at the edge of the property taking pictures like she was documenting a crime scene. And that should have told me everything I needed to know about what kind of street this really was. I didn't even live in that neighborhood. I was just there because my buddy Luis owns a small hardware store outside of Mason Creek, Tennessee, and every now and then I help him deliver mulch, fix fences, haul junk, whatever pays for gas and beer money. That morning we were dropping off a used push mower for an older customer when I first saw the house. Honestly, at first glance, it looked abandoned. Grass up to your calves, vines crawling over the porch railings, tree limbs hanging so low they scraped the roof every time the wind picked up. The whole place looked tired. Not dirty, not trashy, just forgotten. And sitting on that porch was this tiny woman wearing a faded blue cardigan even though it was almost 80 degrees outside. Her name was Eleanor Bishop, but everybody on that block called her Miss Ellie. She had one of those soft southern voices where every sentence sounded halfway to an apology, like she'd spent her whole life trying not to inconvenience anybody. She smiled when we pulled in, but I could see embarrassment all over her face before she even spoke. "I know it looks awful," she said quietly, glancing back at the yard like it personally betrayed her. "I've been trying little by little." Luis gave me that look, the one that basically says, "Don't start," because he already knew where my brain was headed. Turns out her husband Walter used to take care of the whole property himself until he passed from a stroke 14 years earlier. After that, the yard slowly got away from her. First the flower beds, then the hedges, then the grass altogether. Her son lived 2 states away driving long-haul trucks. Her knees were bad enough she needed a cane some days, and hiring landscapers around Mason Creek had gotten stupid expensive. But none of that was what really got under my skin. What got me was the bright orange notice taped to her front door. City code violation. Failure to maintain property. Compliance required within 7 days. I remember reading it twice because I thought surely there had to be some kind of mistake. 7 days. For an old woman who could barely make it down her own porch steps without holding the railing. "How much is the fine?" I asked. She tried laughing it off, but her eyes watered before the words came out. $850. Man, I swear my stomach dropped. $850 might not ruin some people, but for her, that was medication money, grocery money, heat during winter money. And the crazy part was, she wasn't angry about it. She was ashamed. That's the part one still can't shake. Like somehow she believed she failed the neighborhood because old age finally caught up to her. Luis muttered under his breath, "Damn shame," then headed back to the truck. But before he climbed in, he leaned toward me and said, "Don't get involved with these HOA people, man. This neighborhood's nuts." I should have listened. Seriously, I should have just nodded, gotten in the truck, and driven away. But then Miss Ellie looked out at that jungle of a yard and said something I still think about sometimes. She said, "Walter used to love this lawn. He'd probably be heartbroken seeing it like this." That did it. Something about hearing her talk about her husband like he'd just stepped out yesterday. I don't know. It hit me right in the chest. So I told her, "Well, maybe we can clean it up a little before he starts haunting the place." And for the first time all morning, she laughed. Tiny laugh, but real. About an hour later, I came back with my trailer, my mower, weed eater, hedge trimmers, gas cans, all of it. The second I fired up the mower, curtains started moving up and down the whole street like people were watching a parade. You ever get that feeling where you know you just stepped into somebody else's ongoing drama without realizing it? Yeah, that was exactly what this felt like. And then I saw her, standing across the street in white capri pants and giant sunglasses, holding a clipboard against her chest like she worked for the FBI. Denise Harland, president of the Maple Glen Neighborhood Association, unofficially, of course, though she acted like the mayor, sheriff, and Supreme Court all rolled into one bitter little package. She stared at me for a solid 30 seconds before marching across the street with this tight smile that never touched her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. Not friendly, not curious, territorial. I shut the mower off and wiped sweat off my forehead. Just helping Miss Ellie with her yard. Denise looked past me toward the porch where Eleanor stood nervously twisting her hands together. Then she looked back at me and said, "Funny, because this property is currently under review by the association." Right there, I knew this wasn't about grass anymore. I remember looking at Denise for a second thinking maybe she was joking, because who says something like that about an old widow's lawn with a straight face? But she wasn't joking. You could see it in the way she stood there, chin tilted up slightly, clipboard tucked against her chest like she was carrying legal documents instead of neighborhood gossip. Under review, she repeated, slower this time, like she wanted the phrase to sound important. And outside contractors are supposed to be approved before work begins. I almost laughed. Outside contractors. Lady, I was wearing muddy boots and a t-shirt with barbecue sauce on the sleeve. I wasn't exactly a licensed landscaping corporation. Well, I said, trying to keep things light. Good thing I'm not charging her. Denise didn't smile. Behind her, I noticed a couple blinds shifting in nearby windows. Folks were watching. Small-town neighborhoods are like that. People act bored until there's conflict. Then suddenly, everybody becomes a courtroom audience. Miss Ellie stepped carefully off the porch, one hand gripping the rail. Denise, honey, it's all right, she said softly. I asked him to help me. But Denise barely acknowledged her. That was the first thing that really bothered me. Not the attitude toward me, toward Eleanor. She talked around her instead of to her, like old age had somehow stripped away her authority over her own property. Denise flipped a page on her clipboard and sighed dramatically. Mrs. Bishop, we've discussed this several times. The neighborhood has standards. Standards. Man, I hate that word now. People use it when they want to sound righteous while doing something ugly. I could feel irritation climbing up my neck, but I kept my voice calm. Look, the yard's getting handled. Isn't that what matters? Denise looked me dead in the eye. What matters is procedure. There it was. Not kindness. Not helping somebody. Procedure. The kind of people who worship rules usually do it because rules let them control others without feeling guilty about it. And from what I'd learned later, Denise Harlan had built her entire identity around controlling that street. Her husband Gary used to be on city council before he died a few years earlier, and ever since then she'd basically appointed herself guardian of Maple Glen. She monitored garbage cans, measured fence heights, complained about parking angles. One guy told me she once reported kids for drawing chalk on the sidewalk because it reduced property appeal. That's who we were dealing with. Still, I figured if I ignored her long enough, she'd eventually get bored and leave. So I restarted the mower and got back to work. For a while, all I heard was the engine growling under the Tennessee heat while lines of tall grass folded down behind me. Honestly, it felt good. There's something satisfying about restoring order to a place that's been slipping away. Every clean stripe across that lawn felt like giving Miss Ellie a little piece of dignity back. But Denise wasn't done. About 20 minutes later she came back, this time with another woman trailing behind her, holding an iced coffee and looking way too excited about the situation. That's him, the woman whispered loudly. Denise nodded. Then she raised her voice. Sir, I'm asking one final time for your business license. I shut the mower off again. Ma'am, I cut grass. I'm not performing surgery. The iced coffee lady snorted, trying not to laugh, and Denise shot her such a cold look I thought the woman might evaporate on the spot. This neighborhood has regulations, Denise snapped. And people move here specifically because those regulations are enforced. Really? I said. Because right now it kinda looks like people move here to bully widows. That landed harder than I expected. Even the iced coffee woman looked uncomfortable after that. Denise's face tightened instantly. You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Then explain it to me, I said. Because from where I'm standing, an old lady loses her husband, gets too weak to mow her yard, and somehow the community response is threatening her with almost $1,000 fine. Miss Ellie quietly said my name, nervous, probably worried I was making things worse, but at that point I couldn't stop. Denise lowered her voice then, which somehow felt meaner than yelling. Do you know how many chances she's been given? She asked. Do you know how many complaints we've received? Complaints from who? I asked. She folded her arms. Neighbors. I looked around the street. Funny thing was, nobody looked angry. Curious? Sure. Uncomfortable? Definitely. But not angry. Most people seemed embarrassed this confrontation was even happening. Then an older man watering flowers 2 houses down suddenly called out. Ah, hell. Denise, let the guy mow the lawn. Denise whipped around so fast I thought her sunglasses might fly off. Frank, this does not concern you. Frank shrugged. Looks like concern in everybody now. I liked Frank immediately. Denise clearly did not. She turned back toward me and said, "If something happens on this property, the association can be held liable." "Like what?" I asked. "Grass poisoning?" The iced coffee woman laughed out loud this time. Denise ignored her completely. "You think this is funny," she said, stepping closer. "But there are legal processes for these things." And meanwhile, she gets fined into the ground. Denise's expression changed then, just for a second. Tiny crack in the armor. Because deep down, she knew how bad this looked. But pride's a dangerous thing. Once certain people start climbing a hill, they'd rather die on it than admit they shouldn't have started climbing in the first place. "This neighborhood spent years building its reputation," she said quietly. "One neglected property affects everybody." I glanced at Miss Ellie's house, then back at Denise. "You know what affects a neighborhood worse than tall grass?" I asked. "People forgetting how to act human." Oh, that one hit. You could actually feel the air change. Even Frank stopped watering flowers. Denise stared at me long enough I thought she might slap me. Instead, she smiled. And somehow that was worse. "Fine," she said softly. "Do whatever you want." That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. About an hour later, while I was trimming weeds along the walkway, a white city code enforcement truck rolled slowly up the street and parked right in front of the house. Miss Ellie looked like she was about to faint. "Oh dear Lord," she whispered. Denise stood on her porch across the street pretending to check her phone, but I caught the little smirk pulling at the corner of her mouth. She called them. Of course she did. A tall guy in a reflective vest stepped out, holding a tablet. He looked exhausted before he even reached the yard, like life had already disappointed him several times that day. "Afternoon," he said cautiously. "We got a report about unauthorized property work." "You mean lawn mowing?" I asked. He glanced around at the half-finished yard. "Technically. I swear, bureaucracy turns normal humans into robots." Miss Ellie immediately started apologizing even though she'd done nothing wrong. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause trouble." And man, something about hearing her apologize to people actively making her life harder just broke something inside me. The inspector looked uncomfortable too. "Ma'am, nobody's in trouble," he said gently. "We just have to respond when complaints are filed." Complaints. Plural. Denise really sat inside her air-conditioned house filing multiple complaints on an 82-year-old widow getting free yard work. Imagine being that committed to misery. I stood up from the trimmer and asked, "Off the record, does this honestly seem necessary to you?" The guy hesitated, long enough to answer without answering. Then he sighed quietly. "My grandmother lives alone," he said. "So no, not really." That was the moment the whole thing shifted. Because suddenly it wasn't just me versus Denise anymore. Other people on the street started stepping outside. Frank walked over first, then the iced coffee lady, then a younger couple pushing a stroller. Nobody said much at first, but they stayed, watching, listening, and Denise realized it too. The audience she thought would support her was starting to lean the other direction. Still, she wasn't backing down yet. Not even close. You could tell Denise felt the ground shifting under her. And people like that hate losing control in public more than anything. She stayed across the street at first, arms folded tight, pretending she didn't care, but every few seconds she'd glance over and see more neighbors drifting toward Miss Ellie's yard instead of away from it. Funny how fast silence changes sides once one person finally says out loud what everybody else has been thinking. The city inspector stood there awkwardly tapping his tablet, while the younger couple with the stroller started quietly picking up fallen branches near the curb. Then Frank disappeared into his garage and came back with hedge clippers like he'd been waiting years for an excuse to rebel. Even the iced coffee woman joined in, mumbling, "Well, if we're all apparently criminals now." That got a laugh out of everybody except Denise. And for the first time all afternoon, Miss Ellie smiled without looking nervous afterward. Not a polite smile, a real one. The kind that reaches somebody's eyes when they suddenly don't feel alone anymore. I went back to mowing while the inspector wandered around pretending to examine code violations nobody cared about anymore. Every pass across the lawn made the whole property look lighter somehow. Sun started hitting patches of grass that probably hadn't seen daylight in months. The walkway reappeared. Flower beds emerged from under weeds. You could almost feel the house breathing again. At one point I looked up and saw Miss Ellie standing near the porch steps, holding an old framed photograph against her chest. I shut the mower off and walked over. "That your husband?" I asked. She nodded. "Walter Bishop." Big, square-jawed guy with silver hair and grease stains on his jeans, standing proudly beside the same yard back when everything was green and perfect. He used to mow every Saturday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, she said, smiling at the picture. Drove me crazy because the mower always woke me up. Then her voice got softer. I'd give anything to hear that mower again. Man, sometimes grief sneaks up on you in weird little sentences like that. Not dramatic speeches. Just tiny honest things that hit harder than they should. Before I could say anything, Denise finally crossed the street again. Only this time she wasn't loud. Somehow that made it worse. She walked straight past me and looked directly at Miss Ellie. You know, she said coldly. People were trying to help you before it got this bad. The whole yard went quiet. Frank stopped clipping hedges. Even the inspector looked up from his tablet. Miss Ellie's smile disappeared instantly. I know, she said softly. Denise tilted her head slightly. But every time someone offered solutions, you resisted. There was something ugly hidden under those words. Something personal. And then it clicked. This wasn't really about grass. It was pride. Months earlier, Denise had apparently pushed hard for Miss Ellie to sell the house and move into assisted living. According to Frank, she'd been saying for over a year that the property was dragging down home values. She wanted the house cleaned out, renovated, flipped, neat, and profitable. But Miss Ellie refused because it was the home Walter built with his own hands back in the 70s. To Denise, that refusal became some kind of personal insult. She convinced herself she was being practical, responsible, efficient, the kind of lie people tell themselves when compassion becomes inconvenient. Miss Ellie gripped that picture frame tighter and quietly said, I wasn't ready to leave my home. Denise gave this tiny shrug. Sometimes we don't get to hold on to things forever. I swear the temperature dropped 10 degrees. There it was. Finally, the real fight underneath all the HOA complaints and violation notices. One woman saw a house. The other saw a life. Before Miss Ellie could respond, Frank stepped forward holding those hedge clippers at his side like an old cowboy about to draw. Denise, he said calmly, you need to stop. She looked stunned. Excuse me. I said stop. Frank pointed around the yard. Look around. Nobody here thinks this is about community standards anymore. Denise laughed once, sharp and bitter. Of course you'd all turn this into a morality play. No, I said quietly. You did that yourself. She looked at me then with pure hatred. Not because I mowed a lawn, because I interrupted the version of reality she'd built for herself. The one where she was the responsible protector and everybody else was unreasonable. But control falls apart fast once witnesses stop cooperating. The inspector finally cleared his throat. Mrs. Harland, considering the property is actively being maintained, I don't see any reason to proceed with enforcement today. Denise stared at him like she couldn't believe he'd betrayed her too. You're kidding. No, ma'am. He gave an awkward little shrug. Honestly, looks pretty good. And that was it. No dramatic victory music. No applause. Just a tired city employee admitting the obvious while a neighborhood quietly watched one woman lose the argument she'd built her identity around. Denise turned without another word and walked back across the street alone. Nobody followed her. Nobody called after her. The screen door slammed behind her house so hard the sound echoed down the block. Then everything got quiet again except for cicadas buzzing in the trees and the soft rumble of my mower starting back up. About an hour later, the yard was finished. Clean edges, fresh-cut grass, clear walkway. Nothing fancy, but cared for. That matters more than perfection ever will. Miss Ellie stood at the end of the driveway looking out over the lawn while the evening sun lit everything gold. She kept shaking her head like she couldn't believe it was real. Walter would have loved this, she whispered. Then she hugged me. Tiny little woman. Barely came up to my chest. But I'm telling you right now, I've had people twice my size hug me with less weight behind it. Before I left, Frank handed me a cold beer from his garage fridge and said, You realize Denise is gonna hate you forever now. I laughed and said, Honestly, I think she hated me the second I touched the mower. But driving home that night, windows down, smelling like gasoline and fresh grass, I kept thinking about how easy it is for people to confuse rules with righteousness. Communities are supposed to protect vulnerable people, not pressure them out once they become inconvenient. And maybe that's the part one can't let go of. Because if a neighborhood can look at an old widow struggling alone and respond with threats before kindness, then something's gone rotten way deeper than an overgrown lawn. I still go back every Saturday morning now, usually around 8 o'clock, just like Walter used to. And every single time I start that mower, Denise's curtains twitch across the street like she's still keeping score. Maybe she thinks I embarrassed her. Maybe she thinks I undermine the neighborhood. Or maybe deep down she knows the truth, that sometimes the people hiding behind rules are just angry nobody challenged them sooner. But I want to know what you think. Was Denise actually trying to protect the neighborhood, or was this straight-up cruelty disguised as responsibility? And if you lived on that street, whose side would you be on? Let me know in the comments, because trust me, people around Mason Creek still argue about it to this day.